No chance of getting any sleep.
In Russia, large-scale raids by law enforcement on ordinary citizens have begun in order to find gasoline canisters, and this is not a joke. Shebekino in the Belgorod region is going underwater after a dam burst, and last night Belgorod was also hit, as was Anapa in Krasnodar Krai. In addition, Ukrainian drones struck directly at a facility owned by people close to Vladimir Putin, and Russian farmers were advised to switch to, attention, steam boilers, and this is also not a joke. Get this. Steam boilers, and this is also not a joke. Ukraine continues massive and, importantly, effective drone strikes across all of Russia. And I'll start with a detail that describes what's happening in Russia much better than any reports. In the Pskov region, law enforcement officers have started going around private homes and garages looking for people's gasoline stockpiles. Not drugs, not weapons, no gasoline. Governor Mikhail Vedekin reported that during raids on garage cooperatives, serious violations were discovered. In particular, citizens were storing fuel reserves in canisters, and reports were filed against all of them. The fine is up to 15,000 rubles. Moreover, the governor even boasted that the violators were found thanks to reports from neighbors who said that people were bragging about having canisters of gasoline. This is what it has come to. After that, Ukrainian drones struck a logistics center near Moscow, which belongs to the foundation of Vladimir Putin's closest friend. And after that, suddenly Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov immediately urged Europe to enter urgent negotiations. The fuel crisis has officially started to put pressure on the entire economy of this so-called country. So much so that it even affected the banking system of the Russian Federation. Meanwhile, the Sea of Azov, blocked by Ukrainian drones, has brought Russian grain exports down to their lowest level in 10 years. So, let's break all of this down step by step. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's figure out all these topics together. But before we start, subscribe to this YouTube channel. We're moving towards the 300,000 subscribers mark, and I would personally appreciate your subscription.
Yeah, like anyone's gonna subscribe here, damn it. Why not? How much time? An hour, maybe 2.
So, on the night of July 21, at least 350 Ukrainian drones were flying over Russia. And it's known that not only drones but also missiles hit Belgorod, and there was also a strike on Anapa in the Krasnodar region, but not only there. But now let's sum up the past day, as some very interesting targets were hit there. First, as a result of the drone strike on the dam of the Belgorod reservoir, flooding began in Shebekino. The breach spanned the full width of the spillway. The length of the damaged section is about 35 meters. Thus, the Russians are now having their logistics cut so that they don't even think about moving toward Ukraine. In general, the flooded areas mean that the Russian herd definitely won't be moving toward Ukraine. And as local media report, the current damage is much more serious than in the fall of 2021. Back then, only the sluice gates were damaged, and the Russians were also trying to advance on the Kharkiv region. This time, there was an actual collapse of the dam in the spillway area. Second, while the Russians are whining that their goods burned down in the Wildberries warehouses, what should I do? I lost goods worth 10 million. It turned out that on the morning of July 20, drones from the armed forces of Ukraine attacked the Southern Gates logistics complex in Domodedovo near Moscow. This is a huge warehouse hub with a total area of 600,000 square meters, and it is located about 28 kilometers south of the Moscow Ring Road. A fire broke out in the warehouses, and for some reason, those same Russians started whining again, completely forgetting that their army has already destroyed several regular Nova Pochta warehouses in Ukraine.
Yes, that's not true. That's not true. And the boss. Subtitles I didn't hear that.
And here's what's interesting. Right after this strike on the Southern Gates logistics hub, the Kremlin began to very loudly express its dissatisfaction, and Vladimir Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, immediately came out to the press and stated that Russia is officially ready to start negotiations with Europe as soon as possible. You might wonder, what do burning warehouses have to do with such a reaction from Peskov? The publication found that the complex that was attacked belongs to a foundation called Talent and Success, whose founder is the famous cellist Sergei Roldugin. Sergei Roldugin is a close friend of Vladimir Putin. Moreover, the chairman of the board of trustees of this foundation is Vladimir Putin himself. And according to the Spark system, the foundation owns 84 operator companies of instant development warehouses. In other words, Ukrainian drones actually struck property directly connected to the Russian president's inner circle. And it's telling that right after this, Putin's spokesperson Peskov practically begged for negotiations. He says, "Oh, we're ready, Europeans, let's talk. Why are you hitting our warehouses like this? Let's negotiate." And notice, while the goods were burning, some kind of plants or whatever, nobody cared at all about the Wildberries warehouses before Peskov. Nobody cared. Russians are whining on threads about not getting compensation or something else, but honestly, nobody cared. Objectively, absolutely nobody cared. But when the warehouses belonging to Putin's closest circle were hit, suddenly everyone started talking about negotiations. And the story of the ownership of the burned warehouses in Domodedovo is also telling. The thing is, until 2022, the hub belonged to the Czech company PPF, which decided to leave Russia because of the war in Ukraine and sold its assets. So even these warehouses were not built by Russians, they didn't even belong to them. And so, at the beginning of 2026, the main owner became a Putin-affiliated fund. Among the tenants of the warehouses in this hub are Wildberries, Alibaba Group, and Limana Pro, according to the governor. According to the governor of the Moscow region, Andrei Vorobyov, 7 people were injured during the attack in Domodedovo. 6 of them were hospitalized, including 3 Chinese citizens. The president of Ukraine, Zelensky, confirmed the strikes and noted that the distance from the Ukrainian border to the targeted sites is more than 400 kilometers. In addition to Domodedovo, drones also struck an oil depot and another Wildberries warehouse in Podolsk on that day. They also targeted a military airfield in Kuban, 7 electrical substations in Crimea, and a gas station in Belgorod. In short, after the oil refineries, the new targets for Ukrainian drones became Wildberries warehouses, since military goods were stored there, including unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, and importantly, fiber optic cables for them. But that's not all. The Russians themselves boasted the other day that Wildberries was even involved in delivering certain military equipment there. It's important to note that the shift to striking the occupiers' warehouses after hitting oil refineries is not accidental. The thing is, the strikes on oil refineries have generally served their purpose and triggered a very interesting process inside Russia, which even I did not expect. Russian banks have started preparing for the central bank of the Russian Federation to raise the key interest rate again precisely because of the fuel crisis. Financiers have noticed that the interbank market is already pricing in such a reversal. And this is an important signal because until now the central bank of the Russian Federation had been gradually lowering the rate, but now it is ready to reverse course. To grasp the scale, we need to walk through the timeline. At the end of 2024, due to military inflation, the central bank of the Russian Federation raised the rate to 21%. This is a level that hasn't been seen since the early 2000s. Then, for more than a year, the central bank was lowering this rate, and now the fuel crisis might not only stop this process, but actually reverse it and lead to another increase. Deputy Chairman of the Central Bank, Alexei Zabotkin, July 14. He stated directly that the regulator cannot turn a blind eye to the situation with fuel prices and will be forced to take action. The reason is very simple. Gasoline and diesel are part of the consumer basket, and their price increase directly accelerates inflation, followed by a rise in the cost of everything related to transportation. And according to Rosstat, retail gasoline prices have already shown a record growth in the past 20 years. That is, for nearly all of dictator Vladimir Putin's rule. At some private gas stations, a liter of gasoline is already being sold for 140 rubles, and in Crimea and Sevastopol, the price has reached 200 rubles per liter, or even up to 350. And this shock is spreading to all areas of life. First, car sales in Russia have officially collapsed. People simply realize that it's not worth buying a car. Why buy one? Because there's nothing to fill it up with anyway, so car sales have plummeted. Second, more than 25 regions of the Russian Federation have officially raised the cost of public transportation. In other words, transport companies are simply passing the increased cost of diesel fuel onto their passengers. Third, officially in 13 regions of the Russian Federation, get this, police patrols, Russian National Guard and volunteers are on duty at gas stations. They disperse the wild Russians who are fighting each other while waiting in line. And in addition, they guard the gas stations themselves from these savages so that these Russians don't just start smashing things and stealing gasoline. And in the Irkutsk region, law enforcement officers are even detaining people whom the authorities are already calling profiteers. But in fact, as in the example of the Pskov region, people bought gasoline, poured it into a canister, and stored it in their garage. Law enforcement swoops in saying, "So you're profiteers storing gasoline in canisters in your garage? That's a 15,000 ruble fine." The authorities' reaction to the discontent of the Russian people is also telling. In United Russia, that's Putin's party, they compared Russians' outrage by the fuel crisis to, quote, offended teenagers. And the deputies say that there's no need to whine. They say, in the 1990s we somehow survived, and now you'll somehow survive too. Another area where Ukrainian strikes have had an effect is the sea. The blockade of the Sea of Azov by Ukrainian drones has brought Russian wheat exports down to their lowest level in a decade. The logic here is very simple. A significant portion of Russian grain exports, up to 20 to 25%, goes through the Sea of Azov, and now the ports and ships there are under constant attack. There is basically no one left to sell the grain to, and no way to do it. Shipping it by sea has become too dangerous. For Russia, this is a double blow. The country is losing not only oil revenues due to attacks on refineries and ports, but also foreign currency earnings from grain, which is one of the main export goods of the Russian Federation. At the same time, Ukraine also reported on the Crimean ferries. According to the statement from the Unmanned Systems Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, out of the 5 ferries that operated to Crimea through the Kerch Strait, 3 have been completely destroyed, and the remaining 2 have essentially turned into barges, meaning they no longer serve as proper ferries. This part of the campaign, to isolate the Crimean Peninsula, is blocking maritime logistics in addition to strikes on electrical substations. And against the backdrop of all these problems, the Kremlin is trying to create at least some good news. Vladimir Putin was informed about the return of Russian control over the so-called land bridge to Crimea. Yes, you heard that right. You know, when I saw this news, I was just stunned. I was like, wait, what's going on? We're talking about a land corridor along the coast of the Sea of Azov, which connects Russia with the occupied Crimea through the occupied part of southern Ukraine. And the thing is, Ukrainian forces haven't physically liberated it, they haven't entered that territory. But Ukrainian drones, as you know, have been striking logistics in that area, complicating any supply efforts. I specifically went and checked the information, and I saw several videos, several verified videos, about how just yesterday Ukrainian drones attacked vehicles on the so-called Novorossiya highway along this very land corridor. And then suddenly there's news that Putin had been informed that the land corridor was back under the control of the Russian Federation. Honestly, I was really taken aback. So the report to Putin about regaining control over the land corridor to Crimea is basically incidental. It's an attempt to present at least some kind of positive picture against the backdrop of a flood of bad news. Burning warehouses, empty gas stations, a collapse in exports. Now even law enforcement is coming to garages, raiding and checking all the fuel cans. The Kremlin needs to show that at least somewhere things are going well. But, you know, at first I was taken aback, and then I thought maybe the wild Russians really are so dumb that they actually bought this story about regaining control of the land corridor. But how dumb do you have to be not to realize that they never physically lost it in the first place? And the final news item which made me smile. Against the backdrop of a severe fuel crisis and a diesel shortage, the Ministry of Agriculture of the Russian Federation suggested that Russian farmers consider using heating oil, which is usually used in steam boilers and industrial furnaces, as well as diesel with a higher sulfur content. That is Euro 2 standard. Well, all civilized countries have already forgotten that such a standard even exists. And so the agency requested information from regional agricultural authorities about the readiness of farms to purchase such fuel, noting that the Ministry of Energy has confirmed the possibility of its production. And now I will quote the Russian publication Kommersant, because honestly, I just can't say such nonsense with a straight face. Here is the quote. Sources from Kommersant in the industry believe that heating oil and low-quality diesel are only suitable for old Soviet equipment, while modern imported tractors and combines are more demanding when it comes to fuel quality. As clarified by the general director of the pedigree farm Lazarevskaya, the use of heating oil in modern equipment is strictly prohibited, as it can lead to serious breakdowns and repairs will cost significantly more than any possible savings. At the same time, for old Soviet equipment that the farm repairs on its own, this option turns out to be quite acceptable. In conclusion, Ukrainian drones are striking deep into Russia and are now reaching property connected to Vladimir Putin's closest circle. The fuel crisis has gone from being a problem at gas stations to a factor that is making the central bank consider raising the interest rate, causing car sales to plummet and driving up fares in a quarter of the country's regions. The Sea of Azov blocked by drones has brought grain exports down to a 10-year low. And now the government, which can't provide people with gasoline, is sending law enforcement to search garages for hidden fuel cans and fine people for them. This is what the Ukrainian campaign of long-range strikes is gradually leading to. It's systematic pressure on several arteries at once. First oil refining, then logistics, exports, transport and finance. And judging by the fact that the Russian authorities have resorted to raids on garages and searching for gasoline cans among ordinary Russians, the Kremlin is feeling this pressure more and more, and that's good news. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care. Goodbye, everyone.